It's all right. I've got you.
It was only when his headlights flickered across a frail figure huddled in the gutter that he slammed on the brakes. Rain slanted sideways into the night, and she sat there, shoulders curled inward, a stained blanket draped like a veil. Her hair was tangled, her face gaunt with exhaustion. He opened the car door, his heart thudding in his chest. She looked up, her eyes, a shade he recognized from another life, glazed with shock. "Do you remember me?" she whispered, voice cracked like dried clay. In that moment, the world around him dimmed. He recognized the curve of her jaw, the tone of her voice, the way her fingers trembled. He saw his ex-wife, homeless and sitting in the rain, and he felt something inside him. Fracture. What happened between them since their separation? How had someone he once loved so deeply drifted into this shadowed existence? What words would she speak now after so many years, and could he bear hearing them? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. He couldn't move at first. The rain soaked through his coat, but he didn't feel it. All he could think about was how the woman before him had once been the center of his world. Her name used to fill his mornings and close his nights. Now it clung to the silence between them, like a ghost he wasn't sure he wanted to face. She looked older, thinner, but there was still that quiet dignity in her eyes, the same one that made him fall in love with her years ago. Yet behind that gaze, there was something heavier, something unspoken. He wanted to ask how she'd ended up there, but his throat tightened around the words. Maybe it was guilt, maybe fear. He'd built a good life. At least that's what everyone said. A solid job, a nice house, a reputation he'd worked hard to earn. But seeing her like that made all of it feel hollow. How does a life so full of comfort ignore the pain of someone it once promised forever to? And so the questions began to burn. What happened after the day she walked away? Why hadn't she reached out? Or had she, and he simply wasn't listening? What was the truth behind those lost years that led her to this sidewalk on a cold night? As he stood there, he wondered if fate had simply drawn them back together, or if life had come full circle to teach him a lesson he wasn't ready for. He took a breath, but before he could speak, she looked down and whispered, "You always did hate the rain." It wasn't accusation, it was memory, and it hurt more than blame ever could, ever. Before that night, Daniel had been the kind of man people called dependable. He worked long hours at a small auto shop just outside Chicago, fixing engines, saving money, building towards something better. Grace had always been there beside him in those early years, her laughter echoing in their one-bedroom apartment, her hands covered in flour from the tiny bakery job she loved. They didn't have much, but what they had felt real. They'd share dinner over a single candle, talking about dreams that seemed too far away to touch. And in those moments, it felt like love could outrun anything. Poverty, exhaustion, even time. But life has a way of testing promises spoken in the warmth of youth. When Daniel got his break, a chance to open his own repair business, everything changed. The late nights multiplied, the phone calls home grew shorter, the scent of grease and metal followed him everywhere, replacing the smell of her cooking. Grace would wait at the table, her food going cold, and as she tried to remind herself that this was all for them, but when he finally came home, he was too tired to talk. She'd smile anyway, trying to hold on to the man who once danced with her in their tiny kitchen. Years passed, and the distance between them widened, like a crack in the wall no one bothered to fix. He was chasing success. She was chasing him. They stopped speaking the same language of love, each retreating into silence that grew heavier with every passing day, until one evening, after another argument about nothing and everything, Grace packed her things. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just said quietly, I hope you find what you're looking for." Then she walked out the door, leaving Daniel with an echo that never quite faded. He told himself she'd come back when things calmed down, but weeks turned into months, and months into years. Her number changed. Her friends moved away. Eventually, even the memories began to fade, until that night in the rain brought them all crashing back. Have you ever lost someone? Not because you stopped loving them, but because you stopped noticing they were slipping away. If you had the chance to fix the past, would you take it? A year after Grace left, Daniel's business took off. The auto shop became a franchise. His name appeared in local papers, his photo framed beside shiny new cars. To outsiders, he was a man who'd made it. But the truth was, every celebration felt hollow. Every victory carried the faint ache of someone missing from the picture. He tried to bury that ache under long hours and new faces, convincing himself that success was its own form of redemption. Then one day, news reached him that Grace had fallen on hard times. A mutual friend mentioned seeing her working at a diner miles away. Daniel thought about visiting, but pride whispered louder than compassion. She made her choices, he told himself, the same words he'd repeat every time her memory tried to surface. But deep down, he knew it wasn't her choices that built the wall between them. It was his silence. 2 years later, he remarried. His new wife, Melissa, was kind and patient, but Daniel's heart was already a closed room. He provided for her, yes, but he never truly let her in. There were nights he'd wake up from dreams of Grace, her voice calling his name, her laughter echoing from another life. Melissa noticed, though she never asked. She could see the way he drifted through their home like a man haunted by his own success. And then came the letter, a single envelope left at his office, no return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, blank except for 7 words. "Some debts are paid in time, Daniel." He read it over and over, his pulse quickening. There was no signature, but something about it felt familiar. He dismissed it as nonsense, perhaps a prank. But that night, sleep wouldn't come. He found himself replaying the past, the arguments, the goodbyes, the promises left broken, and somewhere between regret and denial, he realized something he didn't want to admit. The world has a way of circling back to what we refuse to face. When he saw her on that street 12 years later, the letter came rushing back. It wasn't coincidence, it was consequence. The rain had stopped. By the time Daniel found the courage to speak again, he offered to take her somewhere warm, but Grace hesitated, clutching the blanket closer to her chest. "I don't want your pity," she said softly, eyes fixed on the puddle beside her feet. "I just didn't expect you'd stop." Her voice carried no bitterness, only a strange, quiet exhaustion. That single line cut deeper than any accusation could. He wanted to explain, to tell her he'd changed, that he wasn't the same man who let pride destroy what they had. But the words felt too late. Pride has a cruel habit of surviving even when love has died. He knelt beside her, ignoring the mud seeping into his trousers. "Please," he whispered, "let me help." She looked at him then, really looked, and in her gaze he saw both the woman he married and the stranger she'd become. After a long pause, she nodded. They drove in silence, the sound of the wipers marking the years between them. Daniel's mind swirled with questions, but every time he opened his mouth, fear held him back. What if her story was something he couldn't handle hearing? At a small diner on the edge of town, he bought her coffee and a warm meal. She ate slowly, hands trembling around the mug. The smell of cheap coffee and rain mixed in the air, bringing memories of simpler times, when they would sit together at similar tables, laughing about how they'd make it someday. But now there was no laughter, only the weight of unspoken things. When he finally asked where she'd been all these years, she stared at the window, as if searching for an answer in the reflection of the streetlights. "I tried to build a life," she said. "After I left, I found work at a nursing home. It wasn't much, but it kept me steady. Then I got sick, lost the job, lost the apartment. One thing after another, until I just stopped trying. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but her eyes glistened. I told myself you'd never understand what it feels like to have nothing, but now seeing you, I think you might. Her words unsettled him. He wanted to deny it, to insist that he'd always cared, that he would have helped if he'd known. But how could he defend the silence he chose? How could he explain all those nights he thought of her, but never reached out because it was easier to let her stay in the past than confront what he'd done? He reached for his wallet, but she stopped him. "Money won't fix this, Daniel," she said gently. "You can't buy back time." That night, after dropping her at a shelter, he sat in his car for nearly an hour, staring at his own reflection in the windshield. The man staring back looked older, heavier, not just from age but from the weight of years wasted pretending to be fine. He wondered if redemption was still possible, or if some mistakes were meant to haunt you forever. The city around him pulsed with life, people laughing, headlights cutting through fog, the world moving forward. But Daniel felt frozen, trapped between who he was and who he should have been. Over the next few weeks, he couldn't shake her image from his mind. He visited the shelter often, sometimes finding her, sometimes not. Each time they talked, she revealed small pieces of her story. How she'd cared for a dying woman who left her nothing. How she'd slept in her car until it was towed. How some nights she'd sit under bridges humming old songs just to remember the sound of her own voice. Each story broke him a little more. He began helping quietly, donating under a false name, arranging meals for the shelter, repairing their broken plumbing on weekends. But it wasn't charity he sought. It was penance. Grace noticed, though she never mentioned it. One evening she told him, "You don't owe me anything, Daniel. Life just has its way of teaching us who we are." He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that he owed her everything. But again, the words wouldn't come. Have you ever looked at someone you hurt and wondered if forgiveness could still find its way between you? Because for Daniel, each visit, each conversation was a thread pulling him closer to a truth he wasn't ready to face. It was a cold Saturday morning when Grace asked to meet him at a small park near the river. The trees stood bare, their branches etched against a grey sky. Daniel found her sitting on a bench, her worn coat wrapped tightly around her thin frame. She looked tired, but peaceful, as if she had finally made peace with something he couldn't yet understand. When he sat beside her, she smiled faintly. "I've been meaning to tell you something," she began, her breath forming small clouds in the winter air. "I didn't want you to find out like this." Daniel's pulse quickened. He braced himself, expecting another story of hardship or loss. But instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope. The paper yellowed with time. She held it out carefully, her hands trembling. "I wrote this years ago," she said, "back when things first fell apart. I mailed it to you, but it came back unopened." His heart sank as he took it from her, recognizing his own name written in her handwriting. He opened it slowly. Inside was a letter that started simply, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't give up." The rest was a confession of love and pain, of how she'd tried to reach him, how she'd sat outside his old shop for hours one night, watching the lights go out, waiting for him to notice. She wrote about the illness she discovered a year after leaving, how she kept it secret because she didn't want to be a burden. She wrote about the treatments, the jobs she lost, the loneliness that became her closest companion. But beneath it all, there was no hatred, only sorrow. "I wanted you to know," she whispered, "that I never blamed you. I was angry, yes, but I never stopped caring. You were just chasing something the world told you mattered more than love. I used to think I hated you for that, until I realized I did the same thing. I chased a version of happiness that didn't exist." Her voice wavered. "Now I'm just tired, Daniel. I'm tired, and I wanted to see you before I go." He turned to her, his chest tightening. "Before you go?" She gave a small nod. a resigned smile tugging at her lips. "The doctors say it's spreading again. I stopped the treatments months ago." The world blurred around him as he tried to make sense of the words. He wanted to argue, to offer money, hospitals, anything, but she shook her head. "It's okay. I've made my peace. I didn't call you to save me. I just needed you to know I never stopped believing you were a good man." The silence that followed was unbearable. Daniel felt every heartbeat like a hammer against his ribs. He wanted to apologize, but apologies felt useless now, like whispers against a storm. Instead, he took her hand, and for the first time in years, neither of them said a word. They just sat there, letting the river carry the sound of everything left unsaid. Imagine that moment, sitting beside someone you once loved, realizing the years you wasted can never be reclaimed. Would you have the strength to face their forgiveness? Could you forgive yourself? Some wounds heal, others become the stories we tell ourselves to make peace with regret. In the weeks that followed, Daniel visited Grace every evening. He would bring her warm meals from her favorite places, chicken soup from the corner deli, cinnamon rolls from the old bakery she once loved. They'd sit by the window of her small shelter room, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Sometimes they talked about the past, sometimes about nothing at all. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. Grace grew weaker with each passing day, but there was a serenity in her now, a calm acceptance Daniel couldn't understand. He wanted to believe there was still time, that maybe if he prayed hard enough, or gave enough, life would give them another chance. But life rarely works that way. One evening she asked him, "Do you ever wonder what we could have been if we'd just listened to each other?" Her voice was faint, but her eyes were clear. Daniel hesitated before answering. "Every day," he said quietly, "but maybe we had to lose everything, to finally hear what love was trying to tell us." She smiled, a small, tired smile, and reached for his hand. "You always were better with words when it was too late." That made him laugh, though it came out broken like a sob disguised as humor. For a moment it felt like time had folded back on itself, like they were the same two people who once danced barefoot in their kitchen, unafraid of tomorrow. When the end came, it was peaceful. Grace passed away in her sleep one early morning, the soft hum of the city rising like a lullaby outside her window. Daniel was there, holding her hand, whispering her name even after she was gone. He didn't cry right away. He just sat there, staring at her face, the woman who had once been his future, who had somehow become his final lesson. Later that day, as he walked home alone, he noticed how quiet the world seemed, how even the traffic felt muted. Loss has a strange way of making everything sound distant, like the world is still moving, but you've stepped outside of it. In the months that followed, Daniel changed. He sold his company, the one that had once been his pride, and used the money to open a small foundation in Grace's name, one that provided food, shelter, and training for homeless women trying to rebuild their lives. It was his way of making sure her story didn't end where hers had. Every plaque, every donation, every woman who walked through those doors carried a piece of her memory. People would often ask him why he cared so deeply, and he'd simply say, "Because once I forgot what love looked like. Now I remember." Sometimes he'd return to that same park where they'd last talked. He'd sit on the same bench, watching the river move quietly under the bridge, the city skyline reflected in its waters. He'd close his eyes and remember her voice, the way she said his name, the way she forgave him without asking for anything in return. And in those moments, he felt something like peace. Not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that teaches you how to carry it without breaking. Viewers, if you've ever lost someone before you had the chance to make things right, you know that kind of silence. The one that stays long after the apologies fade. What would you have done if you were Daniel? Would you have stopped that night? Or kept driving? Could you forgive yourself for waiting too long to say what mattered most? Sometimes life gives us second chances, but not always with the people we expect. Sometimes Those chances come as lessons disguised as heartbreak. Before you scroll away, and take a moment to think about this. How many times have we walked past someone without realizing that they too once had a story, a family, a dream? How many times have we judged the surface without knowing the storms people carry inside them? Daniel thought he was just seeing a stranger that night, but he was seeing a reflection of everything he had lost: compassion, patience, and the kind of love that doesn't fade when life gets ugly. Grace's story didn't just end in tragedy. It became a mirror, showing him, and all of us, what it truly means to be human. If you've ever lost someone, or watched them fall while you stood powerless, you know that feeling that lingers, the what if. What if I had called sooner? What if I had forgiven faster? What if I had simply listened? We all have a Grace somewhere in our past, someone whose absence still echoes in the quiet hours of the night. But maybe this story reminds us that it's not too late. Not too late to show kindness. Not too late to reach out. Not too late to say the words we've been holding back. Because sometimes one small act of compassion can rewrite an entire ending. So I'll ask you, what would you have done if you were in Daniel's shoes? Would you have stopped to help? Or would you have kept walking, believing that some distances are too wide to cross? Let us know in the comments below. Your thoughts might just help someone who's living their own version of this story. And if this story touched your heart, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it, because someone out there might need to hear it today. Before we go, tell us, where are you watching from right now? We love hearing from every corner of the world, and if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss the next story. Because the next one might just change how you see the world forever.